Welcome to the Hickory podcast. I am Dr. Ann Vertivec with my co-hosts, Sharon Anderson Morris and Wilfred Audley. Hickory stands for hope, health, and healing in concert with ourselves and the earth. Our conversations and our interviews are meant to inspire hope, health, and healing.
Hi, everybody. Today we have a special treat. We get to interview James Balog, who has been a friend of mine since 2012. I know him as Jim. I consider him a friend, and I also consider him my hero. I've never told him that, so I'm telling that for the first time today. And a little bit of background about James Balog is he has been working to educate our planet, our people, about what's happening with our environment and climate change due to the human element. He's one of the most important environmental photographers of our time. He will go down in history as being that. He's already known that as right now, as being the most important photographer of all things that are happening in nature with humans and how we're affecting our climate. He founded the Extreme Ice Survey in 2007, which meant that he and a team of people went throughout the world and climbed glaciers and put cameras on glaciers to do time-lapse photography so that we are able to show future generations what our planet used to look like. And if you have not seen the film Chasing Ice from 2012, please watch that. This film, Chasing Ice, was developed by Jeff Orlowski, directed it. He was also a photographer with James on site. And Jeff was filming Jim's work, photographing all of these glaciers melting and the calves, which means ice falling from the glaciers because of the climate change and documenting history of what's happening to our world because of climate change. And Jeff, at the end of taking all these photographs, showed them to Jim. Instead of just putting them somewhere in an archive, Jeff said, we need to make a movie. And they created Chasing Ice, which was just absolutely fantastic. Jim went on to continue his work with photography of everything to do with the human element. And that's one of the titles of one of his films. With wildfires and climate change, glaciers melting, rising seas, floods, fires, showing everything about how we have affected our planet and continue to affect our planet to hope to create action individually within each of us and understand that we each have a major role in what our future looks like for those that come behind us. So, there's right now, I need to also say there's a new film out called Chasing Time, which I can't wait to see, which follows up from Chasing Ice about what Jim's been up to since then. And kind of like closing the chapter, if I get that correctly, Jim. And I'd really like for you to talk a little bit about all of this after my introduction of you, to say, add on to what your mission has been, how you felt you've accomplished what you've accomplished, and just take us to through the last 15 years of what you've been doing to tell the world about your efforts and successes.
Wow. Well, thank you, Sharon. That's a lovely introduction. I'm going to go back a little bit further than 15 years because really this impulse, this obsession that has been fueling me goes back to about 1980 or 81. So well over 40 years. And I realized that with my interests in the environment and natural sciences and the world around me and all the mountaineering I was doing and the floating of rivers I was doing, that really my calling, my mission was to be an environmental photographer, to look at this intersection of the human animal and all the other elements of nature. And so I've been chasing that subject, like I say, for more than 40 years. Needless to say, as a working photographer, I did a lot of other things for photographic assignments for magazines or advertising agencies that would pay to keep me and my family alive. But the core thread that fired my passions and made me pursue these projects, what in photography are called personal projects. It was this intersection of the human, animal, and the rest of the natural environment. So what's that meant? I mean, way back when, that meant looking at recreational hunting, looking at trapping of large animals in the Rocky Mountains. I got deeply into endangered wildlife starting in about 1986, and did portraits of endangered wildlife for about 10 years. Then overlapping with that in the 90s, I also worked on a series I called Anima, which was a study of the human animal, Homo sapiens, along with our nearest genetic relative, which happens to be a chimpanzee. Believe it or not, chimpanzees are more closely related to us than they are to gorillas and orangutans. So I worked on that series, and I worked on a series called Techno Sapiens, where I was positing that the human animal is turning into a different species as we infuse our lives with more and more technology. What we're doing right here, right now, talking through this rectangular box, is a manifestation and an expression of Techno Sapiens existence. By the late 90s, I started to do portraits of the country's largest, oldest trees, all across the country from the Pacific Northwest to Key West. I photographed, well, I should be able to remember these numbers, but I think we've photographed something like 96 individuals of 40 some different tree species. A lot of the key pictures happen to be in California, because California is the home of the largest, tallest, and oldest trees in the world. So the largest are the sequoia, the tallest are the coast redwood, and the oldest are bristlecone pine. So I did a lot of work with those species particularly. But all through this period, of course, I was aware of changing climate. I did my master's degree basically in a science that's called geomorphology, the study of how the Earth forms itself, how the surface of the Earth is formed. And one of the key things that I was so fascinated by was glaciers. And so as the climate change story came lumbering up over the horizon, I realized, well, one of these days I have to deal with this subject, but I swear I don't know how. And after one other point, there was a period of time where frankly, I thought that the climate story was maybe getting turned into another activist cause that was oversimplified and was a manifestation of people creating heroes, activists, and villains, corporations. That's the typical dynamic that goes on in this simplistic society that we live in. And so I was a little bit hazy about whether climate was real or if it was a manifestation of that sort of exaggeration. And eventually, with some looking back into the ice science, I realized, no, it's not an exaggeration. And yes, somehow I'm going to do something with ice. And that became the Extreme Ice Survey and the story of climate change that comes out of it that you alluded to. And overlapping with the latter parts of the Extreme Ice Survey, I also worked on wildfire, rising seas and storms, impact on human health. What else is in there? That's all packed into the Human Elements book and film.
Yeah.
I should have a copy of the book here to show you, but I don't.
You should.
Too heavy to lift, actually. But it's got all these different dimensions of the story in it. And one other thing I just realized that just a couple months ago, we're in the process of having my life archive of pictures being acquired by the Library of Congress. So we've been editing in a lot of the old bodies of work that I did. And there was something that was gnawing at me from the early and mid 80s, and it was a study of nuclear missile silos in the Midwest as a manifestation of the tension between these agrarian pastoral landscapes and these weapons of mass destruction or mass defense. Well, as we were editing a few weeks ago, wrapping up this Library of Congress portfolio, I realized, boom, okay, this nuclear missile series needs to go in this archive as well, because over the long arc of time, heaven help us, nuclear missiles and their explosive power are a big part of this human nature continuum and the conflict between the two. So anyway, I've talked long enough.
No, you haven't. In fact, you spent 4 years going through 2 million photos, right? For the Library of Congress. And what an honor for the Library of Congress, which is going to last forever and ever and ever. Your legacy of these photographs. And it's what interests me is when you were talking about how you're so humble about feeling so honored to be in the Library of Congress, when I'm thinking, well, of course your work should be in there. There's nobody on this planet who has documented in this short amount of time that we have in our lifetime and your lifetime to show what great changes there have been on so many levels. Like you said, the rising of the seas, the wildfires, you captured all of the interaction of how we've affected our planet in the most amazing photographs I've ever seen, and most people have ever seen. So your contribution, you're not dead, and people are already saying, this is the most amazing person in the world who's showing us what the planet used to look like. Something that nobody else has ever done with time-lapse photography. We forgot to mention that part. Utilizing your time-lapse photography and the amount of effort and hours and the tremendous amount of stress on your body and everybody else in the team's body to get to these remote locations, to change the batteries, to see what's working. Can you talk about that just a little bit, about the exhausting and what motivated you to keep on doing, and describe that to us, that work to show us what our planet has been?
Well, really, Sharon, it's about history. I've been interested in history since I was a little boy. And I'm actually in the process of writing a book right now of stories about my creative life and how I moved through these different phases of the creative life. And just this morning, I was working on a chapter that touches on discovering fossils of ancient animals in coal in a refuse pit in Pennsylvania, and being amazed at, here are these bones, something that was once alive. It's gone. It's gone. And I was 9 years old when I was in there with my father in that coal pit. And so ever since then, I've had a lot of interest in history. And I did a paper when I was in 8th grade on the French Revolution, reading Thomas Carlyle. And I look back, I just read Carlyle again last year, and I'm thinking, how did I read that when I was in 8th grade? But I was just so interested in these subjects, and the fact that there's a story behind us, there's a story that we're living, and there's a story going forward. And that really is the inner fuel of the Extreme Ice Survey. So when I had the idea that we needed to be looking at the changes in the ice, I had a New Yorker assignment one year, a big National Geographic assignment the next year, and it was always about a traditional single frame photographic expression going out to look at the world at a moment in time. And I came away frustrated. I've been photographing single frame images for my entire life, for my entire working life, but it seemed like we were missing something. We were only seeing that moment, not the other moments. And I want to emphasize that all that work, as well as the Extreme Ice Survey time lapse, it's often spoken about that I'm a scientist and I'm doing this science thing and I'm doing this communication and activist thing. But the fundamental dimension of it is that it's an artistic expression by a living human being saying, oh my God, look at this in my world, you know.
Mhm.
I'm engaging with the history as I'm living it, as
Mhm.
you're living it, as our audience is living it, and I'm trying to capture it and put it onto the film, onto the digital binary bits and bytes on the digital cameras. So anyway, after being frustrated with single frame photography, I put out time-lapse cameras with our team. There were a lot of us who worked on this, 15 or 20 people. But I was sort of the chief cook and bottle washer and organizer and primary fundraiser and all that kind of stuff. And we engineered a system of time-lapse cameras that were able to endure these polar winters for multiple years. And we dispersed them in Greenland, Alaska, Iceland, northern Montana. Some eventually wound up in the Canadian Arctic. Some were in, let's see, in the Austrian Alps. Others were in the Himalaya at the foot of Mount Everest. And then I was also, over many, many years, doing what we call repeat photography, where I would sort of establish a place on the ground or even in the air with a helicopter where I had done a shot in a given year, and I would try and recover that same position 2, 3, 4, 5 years later. Because there just simply wasn't enough money and enough time to put out time-lapse cameras everywhere. And in some of the really good sites, including the ones in British Columbia, Canada, they were up in the air. They weren't on the ground. So my first pictures were from a helicopter, and I had to find someplace awfully close to that same spot in the air again. It's not so easy because
Mhm.
helicopter is not a guided missile. But we could pretty much recover those places in the air and get amazing matching pictures showing the evolution of these landscapes. So we've been chipping away at that. The last cameras came down last year, but we collected 1.7 million frames of images. About 200,000 of those are with bad weather. The glass on the housing is masked by ice or rain or whatever, and we threw them out. So there's about 1.5 million pictures that exist in digital form in the National Snow and Ice Data Center archive, which happens to be here in Boulder. And then there's another several tens of thousands of single frame pictures looking at these glacial landscapes and celebrating them, probing them, looking at them in different ways, and seeing what we can do. And there's one other thing I want to mention right now. As we were taking down the last time-lapse cameras in Iceland, I guess that was that 2 years ago or one? I don't know. The time blurs after a while, as we all know. But we're taking the last time-lapse cameras down, and Jeff Orlowski was with me, and Svavar Jonathan's son, who had been with the Extreme Ice Survey team right from the beginning in 2007. And we were out there in the field, and we're realizing, okay, we can take the electronics off the mounts, because there's a huge burden in continuing to maintain the electronics. You have to replace the pieces and parts. It costs money, takes time, there's risk in getting there. But we realized, let's just leave the monuments in the ground, the brackets in the position, so that other people can come back, stick their cameras in the exact same spots, and
Mhm.
make a picture over time. So I've teamed up with a group of people in Iceland at an organization called the Icelandic Glaciological Society to carry on the record of how the Iceland glaciers are changing for the next 100 years. And
Wow.
we're in the process of putting out about 50 monuments all around the country, looking at a lot more places than we were able to do when we were constrained by putting out the electronics. And there's another dimension of it too, which is citizen science, crowdsourcing. So in a few places where a lot of travelers go, tourists go, we have built these beautiful bronze monuments and put out this informational signage at these viewing sites. And we invite the visitor to put their smartphone in this little cradle and snap a picture of the landscape, and using a QR code that's on the signs, send your picture back into the central database in Reykjavik and become part of the observation
Wow.
community that's making the historic record of what's happening.
That's perfect.
We thought so.
That's perfect. That's so much easier than having to go back there and do it yourself.
Way easier.
Well, I just want to jump in real quick, if that's all right. From what you were talking about, it's almost like you were fighting kind of a human condition with these time-lapse cameras, and how you were framing this mission, how you specifically taught about how there's a past, there's the moment, and then there's the future. And this is kind of something where it's so parallel with climate change, and how it's sometimes, and a lot of the time, beyond the human timescale and what we like physically perceive, although we're seeing otherwise nowadays. And I think that, this is kind of, at least in my mind, what you pioneered, this idea of not just the moment, of seeing it over time and the changes over time, and how you pioneered this kind of photography of time lapse, using the time lapse technology to essentially change the frame of mind of how we perceive these changes within the macro environment that is beyond basically our comprehension on a full scale. I'm just curious, I wanted to ask you, is that kind of how you set out, and was your mindset was to kind of change the perception of how we view climate change, or give us an insight, or essentially give us an insight into, kind of that little bit of these macro ways of looking at things, because, our tiny little lives are just a tiny sliver of it, but we can kind of change our frame of mindset to these larger scales. I was wondering if that was kind of in your head at the beginning of all of this.
Well, yeah, it definitely was. I was very conscious of how quickly we forget the past, and the field of view through which glaciers had been seen in the society at large was always from the satellite pictures,
Right.
from the view from 100 or 200 miles up in the air. And the human eyes don't live up there. The human eyes live down here somewhere between 2 feet if you're a little baby and 7 feet if you're a really tall basketball player. And so I wanted to have the place of observation be down on the ground, for one thing. But the other thing is about your question about time. I wanted it to be I wanted to capture a record in a plausible period of time that people could relate to. We had at, when the project started in 2007, there were a number of efforts prior to that time where people went to, they dug up some old archival still photograph from the ground that had been shot in 1910 at a glacier in France or Austria or whatever. And then they repeated that in the year 2000 or 2002 or whatever. And for most people, you go, okay, yeah, all right, fine. Over 75 or 80 years or something, stuff changes. But my notion was, let's see how it's changing in a really short period of time, between like April and May. Because in April, you can remember that little Emily was playing soccer out on the field, and sorry, not April and May, April and October. And in October, she's in 8th grade, so you bracket it in the course of your own life experience. That was really key to it, was to bring it into a human time scale. But that said, we put out those first 24 time-lapse cameras in the spring and summer of 2007. Started at the end of March and it went on until July. And I really thought, oh man, I've consulted with experts in these regions, and hopefully we put the cameras in the right places, but who knows, maybe it isn't right. And I guess we'll be lucky if we see change on 2 or 3 glaciers over these next 3 years. And at the time, I conceived of it as a 3-year, 2 summers project, three winters, 2 summers, because I couldn't imagine doing a project longer than that. In big science, these projects all last only 3 years. That's what the funding cycle from the National Science Foundation, or NASA, is. And so I thought, okay, 3 years. My God, I can't imagine me doing this longer than 3 years. And 2 big shocks. The first one was we were seeing change on a bunch of the glaciers almost immediately. Like in 2 months, we're seeing these things happening where the first pictures are coming back from the field and our jaws are dropping when we run the run the images through the laptop and see what it looks like. And then the other thing was, of course, the project didn't end in 3 years. It went on and on and on and on because we realized that there was an epic piece of history here. And I really felt like, I've got to keep this going as long as I can stand to do it. But, after 15 years, that's a really long time, except for super big science funded by massive quantities of money and big university staffs. Nobody keeps projects going that long. So we after 15 years, I felt like I could quite happily declare victory and go home.
Wow.
So are there currently no cameras right now doing time-lapse photography of the glaciers, Jim?
There actually are a few cameras in Antarctica that I've given to another guy to handle. He works on a tourist cruise ship, an ecotourism cruise ship in Antarctica. And I maintained those for, I don't know, 6-7 years. And eventually I just said, Eric, if you want to keep these going for the sake of the education of the travelers that are coming through, it's all yours. I just gave them the cameras. We eventually wound up with 70 some cameras in the field at some huge number of glaciers. I don't know, 25, 28, 30. I should remember this stuff off the top of my head, and I don't. But it has been an enormous amount of work, an enormous amount of hardware and technology, and the shipping stuff all around the world and so forth. But I'm really proud of what's happened. And if you had told me back in 2007 that we'd still be talking about it today, I would have never imagined it in 100 years, really.
Yeah. Well, I love the fact you sent me, I think, a portion of the book that you're writing right now about how curious you were when you were young. It all started when you were young. And your grandparents were coal miners, right? Of all things.
Of all things.
Of all things. And there's one time that in your lifetime that you we were not sure that humans contributed to climate change. And it's a really beautiful story about how you evolved from being this curious child to the transition into the expert that you are now, and the gift that you've given our planet and the people within to educate on, what we've done and what we're doing to it. So when you retired the cameras, I think that had to be a difficult decision, I'm sure, right?
Yeah, it went on over the course of about 5 years because I couldn't bring myself to face that. And I was slowly taking them out of the field as the years went on.
That was a decision. And I know that your knees were having issues. And I mean, that was rough. Doing that kind of work and trying to climb the glaciers in the elements was taking its toll on you physically.
Yes.
And you just kept on going and you kept doing it. So anyway, I can't thank you enough for all the people that love our planet for showing us what's happened, what it used to look like, and for your continued work. And maybe now we should talk about a little bit about hope, health, and healing, and what drove you. I guess what drove you to get motivated to do what you did that took such a toll on your body and mentally was so stressful. It took you away from your family. You were dedicated to this mission for such a long time. What inside of you helped to get up and say, I'm going to go out there, I'm going to do it. There may not be any money or resources tomorrow, and my knees hurt and I miss my family. What motivated, how did you do that? What was inside of you that kept you going to do that?
There's so many layers of it. We'd be here until tomorrow morning, actually, but I think I want to pick up that thread that you mentioned about the coal mining history first before I get into the details there. The reason that I wrote about my grandfathers being coal miners in Pennsylvania was it was all part of a scene in the Human Element film, which came out in 2018, where I felt profoundly the necessity of acknowledging that I am a member of this life-changing organism, this world's changing organism called the human race. We all are. Too much of this dialogue and social discussion and table pounding and flag waving about climate or environmental change is always taken from a perspective of somebody saying, well, I'm pure and holy, and it's those other guys over there that are really terrible. And I think that's totally wrong. 100% of us, 100.1% of us are in this technological system, social system, financial system, cultural system that's changing the world. And my prosperity today, my ability to do the Extreme Ice Survey, my ability to be here speaking with you today comes from standing on the shoulders of my grandfathers in the coal mines. Get choked up, I'm sorry, I can't help it. My father's father, he's the picture of him right up there. He was actually killed when the roof of a coal mine collapsed. And so that story, that anecdote was my way of acknowledging that I specifically, through that bloodline, I'm connected to these transitions. These pixels and these bits and bytes that we're looking at today on the screen together, that's coming because there's an electric power plant somewhere. And some of those electrons are coming out of the sky, and some are coming from coal mines. Some are coming from natural gas. We're not separated from these things. Almost all of us drive cars. So I can't emphasize enough the importance of saying we all have a role to play in making the world more compromised, and we have a role to play in making the world better. We are in the system, all of us together. So, hope. Why do I have hope? Or what drove me? What drove me was that sense of history, number one. The artist expressing his time, number two. Number three, feeling like I just had this deep, deep, deep obligation. I felt like I had this profound sense of obligation to do this, that I couldn't not do it. I've been reading a lot of interviews with Salman Rushdie lately. You know, he's just come out with this new book, Knife, which is fantastic, incredible memoir about the attack on him a couple of years ago. And he had a wonderful quote on a podcast I heard the other day. He just said, I tell authors that they should write the book that they can't avoid. You know, if you can avoid it, don't do it, because the book is hard work. Publishers are a pain in the ass. And if you can avoid it, don't bother. But this project for me answered exactly that point. I could not avoid doing the Extreme Ice Survey any more than I could avoid doing the tree portraits, the endangered species portraits, the nuclear portraits, the wildfire studies, the images of the children in the rising seas. I couldn't avoid doing it. It was just what had to happen. And so I guess that speaks to the point that I felt like I had a mission and I had a purpose and I had to execute it. And if I didn't, I was wasting my life.
It's pretty amazing. I mean, nobody feels like that. Nobody has this is like your calling, right? So
Yeah,
the universe gave James Balog the childhood, the curiosity, the seeking answers for all the things that are happening, and you did it. You followed that, and you made it happen. And what's interesting now is that you're writing a book. Thank you. Good. It's fantastic, because that's now a continuation, right, of what your purpose is here. Is this your 8th book?
No, if I get this thing done, which I'm determined to do, and I think it'll be number 10 or 11, something like that. My first book that's only words, it's not picture driven.
Right. So,
and I want it to be only words. If a publisher says to me, hey, would you mix this in with photographs all through it? The answer will be, okay, I'm going to a different publisher, because you know, there can be little signatures of pictures here and there through the book. But I want the stories to be the stories, and to use the words to express things that I can't express through the pictures.
And it's absolutely fantastic. I've read the 10 pages that you sent me, and I can't wait to see more. I can't wait to read more, because it explains so much about how you became you. and where that curiosity came from. And for our team. So going back to when you got off the ice and were exhausted, was there anything, just as tools that you used that gave you what you needed to do to get motivated, to rejuvenate you so that you could go back? Music, nature, hikes, whatever, anything that you utilize that could help other people in their lives to keep on going to do something really difficult that's really critical in their lives.
Well, and I think it's important to remember there was nothing easy about this, and it would tear my guts out sometimes going to Greenland or Alaska because I was so afraid that there would be an accident, that that I would fall, or one of my guys would fall, a helicopter would crash, a tower of ice would collapse on it, a crevasse would break, or whatever, and it was hard to leave my family.
Right.
And there were a couple of years there where my wife reminded me at the end of the year that I had been gone 6 months of the year. And I said, no, no way, I've only been gone 4 months. She said, well, let me show you on the calendar. And it would turn out to be like 6.5 or 7 months. So it was hard. And I think that it's worth emphasizing that none of us should expect the good work, the important work, to be easy. If it were easy, lots of people would do it. But the important work sometimes requires a lot of pain and suffering. It just comes with the territory. So you come to accept that. I spent a good bit of my life from the time I was about 18 years old as an avid mountaineer. And I've done some very intense, very difficult climbs in different parts of the world. First ascents, exciting places in the Himalaya and Alaska and so forth. And what you learn when you're of that clan is that you can really have some bad stuff going on around you. The weather can be really horrible, and all you want to do is curl up in a little ball and ignore it somehow. But you learn to put your head down in the storm, to check on the variables you can control. Are your gloves tight on your wrists, or do you have snow blowing in your gloves? Can your hood be tighter to keep the snow out of your face? Is that not tight on the rope? Do we have a good anchor? How's my partner doing? Is he safe? Are we safe? So you learn to discipline yourself, not to be kind of mentally freaking out, and to just put your head down in the storm and go forward. Trust your tools, trust your people, trust your anchors. And I think that's one of the most important things that gave me the fuel to keep on going. But the other really big one that animated me all the time was sort of addressing the emotional schizophrenia of dealing with this issue. Look, the knowledge that the climate is changing, and probably changing permanently, and probably that we're not going back to any better atmosphere for a very long time, that knowledge can be incredibly depressing. And there's been lots and lots and lots of time when I'm just in despair over it. It's just like, God damn it, how did I wind up in this? Why do I have to do this? I don't want to do this. This is unpleasant. And I figured out maybe it was about 3 or 4 years into the Extreme Ice Survey, I learned to look at the mental pattern. And I realized that despair obviously is paralyzing. If you despair about something, all you want to do is, like I said already about being caught in a storm, you want to curl up in the corner of your room, pull a blanket over your head, or look at TikTok or watch TV for the rest of your life and not think about anything. Despair can be painful. Knowledge can be painful. And I realized that I had to take whatever despair I would feel at times and just say, okay, all right, I feel that despair. All right, there it is. I see it. Put it in its box, put it up on the shelf, and say, okay, now I'm going back into action. I'm going to keep that where it belongs and not let it paralyze me. And I have to get back to action. So the point is to to turn the despair into action and not let it paralyze you. And that
Interesting.
applies to many, many, many things. As you and I were speaking yesterday, you know, look, I was diagnosed with a cancer of the blood almost 5 years ago. And believe me, if you want to have something that can make you despairing, well, getting a cancer diagnosis, as so many of us know, is one of those things. And you just have to learn to try and keep it in its cage and not let it crush you.
Right.
And to
Wow.
rely now, and then there's a whole other bunch of thoughts that accrue downstream from that, but I'll hold it right there.
That
Really?
that's brilliant.
Right.
I love so much about what you just said. Just on a couple of those notes, I think you had perfect you know, you actually lived it. You were a mountaineer, but that was a microcosm. That was a perfect symbol of what other in the audience can take away is, you know, you're talking about actually climbing a mountain, but you know, in the real, like with other people, that's the life, you know, it's the idea of that you can't really base your mood and your activity based upon these extraneous factors like the weather and everything that's around you. It's control what you can control, focus on what you got around you, and then keep moving forward. And I just thought that was a beautiful symbol and a metaphor for everybody that's listening, to try to keep moving forward. Beyond that, I mean, like you said, like if it, I take my little quote, based upon what you said is if it were easy, it wouldn't be fun. I thought, you know, you got to keep moving forward, the hard things, embrace the hurdles, and embrace the stops and all the oppression that is facing you. And then beyond that, you know, when you're talking about curling up in a ball and the paralysis by overthinking, I think it's so rampant, especially I guess in maybe my age, or I just see it more in my generation, is that, you know, we've been grown up with these problems, in large part, you know, proven by someone like you, that, you know, a pioneer in all of this. Um, it can be, you know, and now we have in this generation, we have a lot of distractions, as you alluded to. You know, we can go in a dark room and just distract ourselves and not address it. But really facing it head on is exactly how you said it. You know, acknowledge it's there and keep moving forward. And that does take time to, you know, you have to have dialogues with yourself, and you have to understand yourself and understand how to keep moving yourself forward. And you know, I think it's so brilliant that you have, you know, accomplished that, and you're a symbol of it. And I wanted to touch upon one last point that you said at the end. It it sounded like you were saying it's a daily effort. It's not just you can do it once and you know you've conquered it. It's a struggle every day, and you know that's part of the human life, and the human element is that every day you have to conquer it, and you have to seize that, and you have to conquer that fear. And I think that I just wanted to bring this up because we had met in 2018 after you premiered the Human Element, which was a lovely, beautiful movie. Um, I remembered a quote that we talked briefly. We ran into the hall together, and you said something to me, and I actually wrote it in my notes app back in 2018. And I remembered that
That's your first mistake. Okay, go ahead.
And I remembered it, and I just pulled it up, but I might have caught you in a little bit of one of those moments of doubt or existential threat with all these, you know, big looming threats. I wrote it down, and what you said was, I think you were talking to Sharon, and you were talking about, you know, this and that and this and all these problems that we're facing. And then you see me, like, you know, listening, and you turn to me and you say, "Don't be depressed. We're all old and grumpy now. Keep going. It's worth it."
Yeah,
And
Yeah.
it was very simple, but it very stuck with me. So
I
yeah,
love that. Yeah, and here we are, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
What a small world. Here we're coming together. All of us is kind of bizarre. You know, another thing, Jim, that for the other people that we've interviewed that are, you know, doing really critical things for our planet and our world, when we ask them, you know, how do you heal from your hard work? Usually there's an answer that has something about getting out to nature, right? And I know during the breaks when I, you know, was with you during different conferences, you are more comfortable. You were then more comfortable being on the ice than you were at a resort hotel talking about your work. You
I
know,
sleep a lot better on the ice than I do in my own bed.
yes, you're exactly the opposite of what people have, normally say to us, because that is your element. That is your heart and your soul and your mind and your creativity come all together for the right purpose. And then you go home, and that's where the challenge became, was you were with your own mind, comfortably warm in your own bed with your little girl and your wife, and you've got cameras that are over here that need servicing, that need to keep that work going, right? And the team that needs to keep being satisfied and being motivated. So you're like the opposite of what who we normally interview, is because your home was on the ice, Your home was always climbing treacherous crevices and almost falling, and taking care of everybody else in the most extreme circumstances. So when you're home, how did you manage when you were home to be able to be your true self, to get ready for your next endeavor?
Well, I learned through life experience and practice that I have multiple selves. I have the self that's happy in the tent out in Greenland, and I have the self that is blessed to love my family and my friends
Mhm.
and my surrounding community. It's we're not alone, and we have enormous what's the right word? We're nourished. We gain enormous nourishment from this communal environment that we live in. And, look, for me as an American male, we're taught to be individualists. And I swallowed that hook a long, long time ago. And that's how I wound up as a mountaineer. That's how I wound up as a roving photographer, on my own in many, many places with a camera on my shoulder and meet people here and meet people there. But basically, it's me driving the engine all the time. Maverick, solo. And as I mentioned a while back in the context of my grandfathers, I've learned over time and with a lot more wisdom, I'm not alone. I never have been alone. And whether it's because of what my grandparents did generations ago, or it's because what the guy did down at the grocery store an hour ago to give me the oranges, make the oranges available, or the guy who's working in the power plant right now to keep the electronics turned on this screen, we're not alone. We're in a community. And the falsehood of the politics that we're in right now is that there is one faction in this country that thinks we should all be basically isolated, alienated, freelance militias, and into, don't tread on me. Don't let anybody tell me what to do. I am a totally free person. I want pure freedom. I don't want any obligations to anything or anybody. That's not how human society works. It never has. All the way back to people living in caves, sitting around campfires. They're communities, for God's sake. And if we forget that we're in a community, we will destroy ourselves.
Right.
And I say that word community very specifically and with intention, because I used to cringe at the word community. Every time I would hear somebody on PBS say community, I felt like, oh, somebody's putting a noose around my neck. I don't like that. That's like, I don't know, town council meetings and a lot of haggling and arguing at school board meetings. And I still don't like that kind of stuff. I would make a really bad town council member or mayor or anybody doing group process. That's not my thing. But still, I recognize that I am contributing to a community in a positive way. And that community has been nurturing me in a positive way. And that in essence is at the root of what we're all doing. But I want to mention one other thing that springs from something you said a little while ago. We have to acknowledge reality when we think about these problems. The world isn't perfect. The world never has been perfect. And to be an idealist is to live in a certain amount of pain. And what I pick up when I see a lot of the young activists on the street, and they're doing great and noble work, is they're frustrated because the ideal world that they imagine is not the world that exists or ever will exist. There's always been give and take between good and bad, and the world kind of settles into some pathway in between good and bad. It's not all bad, it's not all good, and you've got to learn to live with the opposites, that the opposites coexist all the time simultaneously. Can't get away from it. And all you do is drive a stake into your heart by being frustrated that it's not working out the way I wanted it to work out.
Mhm. Acceptance.
Acceptance, good word. Yeah.
Anne, do you want to jump in here?
Yes, yes, thank you. I just, first of all, want to thank you for your whole career. And you are such a pioneer in looking at things well before the rest of the world really considered them, climate change, but also your ideas about techs and humans. Obviously, that's with AI, it's becoming more and more relevant. Your work about trees and how we're learning so much more about how they live on a whole different time scale, and yet they are much more intelligent. But by honoring them, you brought to light that you talk about nature and how we are really part of nature. Man is not separate from nature. All of these ideas that you've done over the years, and also looking at endangered species, you were ahead of your time. And thank you so much for the work to make others realize that. So with that, I'm wondering, we're talking about hope, health, and healing. I think you've given us some ideas, compartmentalizing and looking at the world with a true lens and community. But I'm wondering what your next observations are, if you have any, on the world, perhaps to keep us hopeful, as you have considered all these areas, looking at glaciers well ahead of others. I just wondered if there's anything, what's next, or what you would suggest for the audience to stay hopeful, because you are hopeful, I feel, despite everything, as you said.
Yeah, about 40 years ago, there was a woman by the name of Jeanette Chapnick, and she was married to my mentor and photo agent, Howard Chapnick. And we were having dinner in New York one night. And Jeanette was always the most chirpy, bubbly person. She was always just happy. And I was belly aching about something or other, about I don't know, it was my wife or my editors or the world at large or something. And she said, Jim, it's just a choice. It's just a choice to maybe not be happy, but at least be content and accept, as Sharon just said. And I think that's actually quite important. And I'm trying to infuse that in my daughters. And it's something I really never came to until relatively recent years. And frankly, probably the years since I've had the cancer diagnosis. It's really easy to feel really bad about the world and yourself when you've got that little cancer genie sitting on your shoulder, always talking to you and eating away at your bones or whatever. But if you think, well, I don't know how many years I have left, but would I rather spend them in a state of grumpiness and anger, or would I choose to accept and be content and at least wake up in the morning with a smile on my face? Well, it's obvious what the answer is. So I try and wake up in the morning with a smile on my face. That's a willed choice. What I remember seeing Al Gore give a lecture at, where was it? I've been to a whole bunch of those UN climate meetings. I think this was in Copenhagen in 2009. And Al just said, you have to make a willed choice, a willful choice to say, okay, I'm going on. That's it. It's a willed choice to be content. The other thing that I think doesn't get enough discussion in our circles, because in our circle, we tend to be idealists. We want everything to be perfect, and it's not perfect. And Biden's not perfect, and the EPA is not perfect, and Exxon isn't perfect, and ain't nobody out there who's perfect. Okay, but by the way, I think Biden has done a fantastic job for the environment. Whatever his failings are, he's done more for the climate issue than all the other presidents in history put together.
Wow.
And by far, there's no comparison. And so I'll be voting for him again, but that's not the point. We need to have some optimism about our tools. We don't talk about this enough. There are amazing technological advances that are happening right under our noses right now, and they're buried at best on page 10 in the New York Times, and they never hit the electronic media. And whether it's the evolution of new power line cables, or it's new battery technologies in electric cars, or it's new technology on the solar panels, or whatever, there are things that are happening that are very, very favorable. Now, is it going to turn the clock back to, less than 400 parts per million of CO2? Probably not, but it sure is eventually, I think, going to stem the continual increase of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And I think we need to pay attention to that and take a certain amount of psychological nourishment from that.
Wow.
I feel
Fantastic.
more hopeful already.
Yeah. Well, Jim, I just, on behalf of our team, can't thank you enough for taking the time with us today. As always, I love seeing you. If there's one person that I would like to spend an hour with, as people ask me, because I do a lot of interviews, it's always you. And it's not somebody from 1920. If ever I get a chance in the near future to spend another hour with you, it would be a gift to me. And it's a gift to us to have you here with us today.
Well,
Thank you so much.
You're very kind. I really appreciate the opportunity. It's great to visit with you and your whole audience. And you triggered me. I'm all revved up because I was writing this morning and I was ready to go. So
I can't wait to read the book. Yeah, that's awesome.
Get it done. Yeah. All right.
Yeah, you'll get it done. You'll get it done.
Take care.
You so much, Jim.
Thank you. All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, Jim.
Bye-bye.